The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between galaxies. It was bigger than most planets, with towers that stretched into space and docking bays that could hold 1,000 ships. Today, something special was happening. Representatives from every known species in the galaxy had come here for a meeting that happened only once every 1,000 years. Elder Keeper Vorthak walked slowly through the corridors of the station. His people, the Zephyrians, lived much longer than most species. Vorthak himself had seen over 3,000 years pass by. His skin was gray and wrinkled, and his 6 arms moved carefully as he carried ancient crystal devices that glowed with soft blue light. The main council chamber was enormous. Thousands of beings sat in rows that went up like a giant stadium. There were the tall, proud Altarians with their golden skin. The small, quick Nexari buzzed around in hover chairs. The massive Krogar sat in special reinforced seats, their rock-like bodies barely fitting. Each species looked different, but they all shared one thing. They had been part of the Galactic Council for hundreds of generations. Vorthak reached the center of the chamber and placed his crystal devices on the speaking platform. The crystals began to hum and holographic images appeared in the air above them. The crowd grew quiet as the old keeper prepared to speak. Fellow beings of the galaxy, Vorthak's voice was old but strong. I stand before you today to share knowledge that has been kept safe in the Zephyrian archives for 50,000 years. Knowledge that comes from the predecessors themselves. A murmur went through the crowd. The predecessors were the first intelligent species to reach the stars. They had built amazing things and knew secrets that modern science still could not understand. But they had disappeared long ago, leaving behind only ruins and fragments of their knowledge. The predecessors left us many warnings, Vorthak continued. Most of these warnings we have learned to understand over time. We learned about the dangers of black holes that eat space itself. We learned about the plague worlds where death still waits. We learned about the regions where reality breaks down and ships disappear forever. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the usually chattering Nexari had stopped moving. But there is one warning we have never understood. Until now. Vorthak touched one of the crystals and the hologram changed. It showed a map of their galaxy with billions of stars glowing like tiny lights. One small area near the edge was marked in red. The predecessors called this region the Forbidden Spiral. They said that somewhere in this area, on a small world orbiting a yellow star, a species would develop that would change everything. They called this species the Breakers of Chains and the ones who refused to yield. Admiral Krex of the Talon Empire stood up in his section. The Talons were a warrior species with sharp beaks and feathers that looked like metal. Old Keeper, with respect, the predecessors have been gone for thousands of years. Why should we care about their ancient fears? Vorthak looked at the Admiral with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Because, honored Admiral, our scout ships have found them. The species the predecessors warned about. They call themselves humans, and they live on the 3rd planet of the Sol system, right where the predecessors said they would be. The chamber erupted in voices. Some beings laughed, others looked worried, and many began talking all at once. General Vox of the Hegemony Forces, a large creature with 4 arms and gray skin, raised his voice above the noise. Show us what makes these humans so special that the mighty predecessors feared them. Vorthak touched another crystal, and new images appeared. They showed a blue and green planet with white clouds swirling around it. Then the images changed to show the creatures that lived there. 2-legged beings with soft skin and no natural weapons to speak of. Look at them, laughed Commander Zilix of the Nexari. They have no claws, no armor, no natural weapons at all. They can't even fly! Their technology is primitive, added Admiral Krex. Our scouts report they haven't even achieved faster-than-light travel. They're stuck on their one little world. But Vorthak held up one of his 6 hands. The predecessors' warning was not about their bodies or their current technology. Listen to what the ancient records say about their minds. The hologram changed again, showing symbols in the predecessors' ancient language, with translations appearing below them in modern galactic script. They adapt to any environment, Vorthak read. Where other species would die, they find ways to live. Where other species would give up, they keep fighting. They turn their weaknesses into strengths and their defeats into victories. They do not accept that anything is impossible. Pretty words, said General Vox, but words don't win wars. My fleets could conquer their entire world in a day. Perhaps, said Vorthak quietly, but the predecessors wrote something else. They said that humans don't just fight for themselves. They fight for an idea. The idea that all thinking beings should be free to choose their own path. And that idea, once spread, cannot be destroyed by any weapon. The chamber was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Some of the beings looked thoughtful, while others still seemed doubtful. "Honored Keeper," said Counselor Thex of the Altarians, "even if everything you say is true, these humans are just one small species on one small world. What threat could they possibly be to our great galactic civilization?" Vorthak looked around the chamber at all the different species. The same threat that one small flame can be to a forest that has grown dry and tired. The same threat that one drop of water can be to a dam that has developed cracks. He touched the crystals again, and they began to dim. "I have shared what the archives commanded me to share. You may do with this knowledge what you will, but remember, the predecessors survived the birth of galaxies and the death of stars. If they thought something was worth warning about, perhaps we should listen." As Vorthak gathered his crystals and prepared to leave, most of the council members were already talking among themselves about other matters. The warning about humans seemed like just another old story to most of them, but not everyone dismissed the Old Keeper's words. In the hegemony section, General Vox was talking quietly with his advisors. The hegemony controlled over 1,000 worlds, and they were always looking for new resources and territory to claim. "This Sol system," General Vox said to his aide, "it's in an area we've been planning to expand into anyway, isn't it?" "Yes, General. Our surveys show the system has good mining prospects and several planets suitable for colonization. Then perhaps it's time for a closer look. If these humans are as primitive as our scouts report, they should be easy to integrate into the hegemony. Better to deal with them now, before they develop any dangerous ideas." Far away in the Sol system, Dr. Sarah Chen was working late in her laboratory on Earth. She didn't know that beings from across the galaxy had just been discussing her species. She was focused on a problem that had puzzled human scientists for decades: how to fold space and time to allow faster-than-light travel. As she worked with equations that would have amazed the Galactic Council, she thought about her daughter, who was training to be an astronaut. Sarah wanted to give humanity the stars, to let her people spread out and explore the vast universe around them. She had no idea that the universe was about to come to them instead. The hegemony war fleet moved through space like a pack of metal predators. 50 massive warships, each one the size of a city, traveled toward the small yellow star that the locals called Sol. At the head of the fleet was the flagship Dominator, where Admiral Kreck stood on the bridge watching the tactical displays. "Target system in sight." "Admiral," reported his tactical officer, "our scouts confirm the inhabitants are still confined to their home system. No defensive fleet detected." Admiral Krex nodded with satisfaction. This would be another easy conquest for the hegemony. In 300 years of expansion, they had never met a species that could stand against their military might. The humans would either surrender quickly and accept hegemony rule, or they would be destroyed. Either way, the hegemony would claim their system and its resources. "Open a communication channel to the third planet," Krex ordered. "Let's give them a chance to surrender before we destroy their civilization." On Earth, the message was received by the Global Defense Network, humanity's newly formed military alliance. President Martinez of the Earth Coalition sat in the Emergency Command Center, surrounded by military leaders from every major nation. The alien message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. "How long until they reach Earth?" asked General Thompson of the Earth Defense Forces. "At their current speed, about 6 hours," replied Admiral Hassan, head of the small space navy humanity had been building. "But sir, we need to be realistic. We have 12 ships and they have 50. Each of their ships is 10 times bigger than our largest vessel." President Martinez looked at the tactical display showing the alien fleet. "What do our scientists say about their technology?" Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been called to the command center, stepped forward. "From the sensor readings, their ships use fusion drives and plasma weapons, more advanced than ours but not beyond our understanding. The real problem is their numbers and size." "Then we fight," said President Martinez simply. "We evacuate the cities and prepare for battle. We may not win, but we won't surrender our freedom without a fight." The first engagement took place near Mars, where a small human patrol fleet had been conducting training exercises. 3 human ships, the cruiser Defiance, the destroyer Liberty, and the frigate Hope, found themselves facing 5 hegemony warships. Captain Elena Rodriguez commanded the Defiance. She looked at her tactical display, and knew this fight was hopeless by any reasonable measure. But humans had never been particularly reasonable when their backs were against the wall. "All ships, this is Rodriguez. We're outnumbered and outgunned. But we have something they don't. We know what we're fighting for. Everyone ready?" "Liberty ready, Captain," came the voice of Commander Park. "Hope ready to show them what humans can do," added Captain Singh. The alien ships opened fire first, sending streams of bright plasma toward the human vessels. But Rodriguez had studied the old naval battles of Earth's history. She knew that sometimes the smaller, faster ship could win against larger opponents if it was smart and brave enough. All ships, Scatter Pattern Alpha, used the asteroid field as cover. The human ships split apart and dove into the nearby asteroid belt. The hegemony ships followed, their massive hulls struggling to navigate between the floating rocks. This was exactly what Rodriguez had hoped for. Liberty target their lead ship's engines. Hope hit their communications array. We're going to make them blind and slow. What happened next amazed both sides. The human ships used the asteroids not just as cover, but as weapons. They used their mining lasers to cut chunks of rock loose, then used their engines to push the asteroids toward the enemy ships. When the hegemony vessels tried to blast the incoming rocks, the humans fired their weapons through the explosions, using the plasma flashes to hide their attacks. Commander Vash of the hegemony forces watched in disbelief as one of his ships was disabled by what looked like a piece of mining equipment, jury-rigged with military weapons. How are they doing this? Their technology is inferior. But technology wasn't the only factor in this fight. When the Hope lost its main engines to enemy fire, Captain Singh didn't retreat. Instead, he used his ship's emergency thrusters to ram directly into a hegemony vessel, boarding it with his Marines while the two ships were locked together. The hegemony crew had never faced anything like human Marines in close combat. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters, chasing prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. That same relentless determination showed in how they fought. When their weapons jammed, they fixed them while under fire. When they ran out of ammunition, they picked up alien weapons and figured out how to use them in seconds. When they were wounded, they kept fighting anyway. Within an hour, Captain Singh's Marines had captured the hegemony ship from the inside. They didn't just take control. They immediately began studying the alien technology, learning how it worked and how to improve it. The battle ended with 2 hegemony ships destroyed, 1 captured, and 2 more fleeing back to their main fleet with reports that made no sense to their commanders. "Admiral," reported Commander Vash over the communication system, "the humans, they don't fight like any species we've encountered before. They turned our advantages against us. They learned our technology during the battle. And, sir, they seem to be enjoying themselves." Admiral Kreck stared at the tactical reports. How had 3 primitive ships defeated 5 of his best vessels? "Prepare the main fleet for assault. We'll overwhelm them with numbers." But word of the Mars battle spread quickly through human space. Every ship captain, every soldier, every civilian who heard the story felt something stir inside them. For the first time in their history, humans had fought aliens in space combat, and they had won. Dr. Sarah Chen worked frantically in her laboratory, knowing that her research might be humanity's only hope. The fold space equations that had puzzled her for years suddenly seemed clearer. Maybe it was the pressure of knowing her species faced extinction. Maybe it was the inspiration of seeing ordinary humans do extraordinary things. Whatever the reason, she finally saw the solution. "Computer-run simulation program 7 Alpha," she said, her fingers flying over the controls. The results made her gasp. Not only would her fold space drive work, but it would allow human ships to appear anywhere in the galaxy almost instantly. More importantly, the technology could be built using resources they already had on Earth. "My God," she whispered, "we can take the fight to them." Meanwhile, on board the captured hegemony vessel, Captain Singh and his team were making discoveries that would change everything. The alien computer systems contained star charts showing the locations of hundreds of hegemony worlds. They also contained records of other species that had been conquered, many of whom were still fighting resistance movements against their hegemony occupiers. "Captain," said Sergeant Williams, looking at the translated data, "according to these records, the hegemony rules through fear. Most of their subject species have been beaten down so badly they don't even try to resist anymore." Captain Singh studied the information with growing excitement. But what if they learned that resistance was possible? What if they saw that the hegemony could be beaten? As the main hegemony fleet approached Earth, they had no idea that they weren't just facing one small species anymore. Dr. Chen's breakthrough was already being transmitted to human colonies on Luna and Mars. The captured alien technology was being reverse engineered by teams of human scientists who worked with the kind of focused intensity that only came from fighting for survival. And most importantly, the humans had learned something the hegemony didn't expect. They had learned that their enemies, for all their advanced technology and vast fleets, could be beaten by intelligence, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat. The real war was just beginning, and humanity was about to show the galaxy what happened when you threatened a species that had spent millions of years learning to survive against impossible odds. News of the human victory at Mars spread across the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible. In the cantinas of the mining world Kythera, workers who had labored under hegemony rule for 3 generations whispered about the impossible story. On the forest world of Verdania, resistance fighters who had been hiding in the deep woods for decades dared to hope again. Even on the industrial planet Nexus 7, where hegemony factories had churned out warships for centuries, the workers began to talk quietly about something they had almost forgotten: freedom. Dr. Sarah Chen's fold space technology had changed everything. 3 months after the first battle, human ships were appearing all over the galaxy. They struck fast and disappeared before the hegemony forces could respond. These weren't the massive invasion fleets that the hegemony used. These were small groups of ships that hit supply convoys, communication stations, and isolated outposts. Captain Marcus Torres commanded one of these new human ships, the light cruiser Indomitable. His crew of 60 humans had been farmers, miners, teachers, and shopkeepers just 6 months ago. Now they were deep in hegemony space, preparing to attack a prison convoy carrying political prisoners from a dozen different worlds. Target: convoy is holding course for the detention center on Baron 3, reported Lieutenant Kim from the sensor station. 4 transport ships with a heavy escort. Looks like 2 destroyers and a cruiser. Torres studied the tactical display. The smart move would be to wait for a better opportunity. The convoy was too well defended for a direct attack. But Torres had learned something important about human nature during the past few months of fighting. Sometimes the smart move wasn't the right move. Communications open a channel to the convoy. "Sir?" asked his communication officer, Ensign Rodriguez. "Are we going to demand their surrender?" "No," Torres smiled grimly. "We're going to give them a history lesson." The message Torres sent was simple, but it spread through the convoy ships like wildfire. He told them about Earth, about the Mars battle, about human cities that had chosen to fight rather than surrender even when facing certain destruction. He told them about the idea that had driven humanity to the stars, that every thinking being had the right to be free. More importantly, he told the prisoners and even some of the hegemony crew members about something they had never imagined: that the hegemony could be beaten. The battle that followed became legendary throughout the galaxy. The Indomitable attacked head-on, but not in the way the hegemony expected. Instead of trying to destroy the escort ships, Torres targeted their communication systems and engines. While they were trying to repair their damage, his boarding parties struck at all 4 transport ships simultaneously. What the hegemony guards found waiting for them was unlike anything in their experience. Human Marines who fought with a combination of tactical brilliance and complete fearlessness. When Sergeant Davis's team was cut off from their escape route, they didn't surrender. Instead, they fought their way through 3 decks of the transport ship, freeing prisoners as they went, and turning every freed being into another fighter in their growing army. By the time reinforcements arrived, the convoy was gone. The hegemony ships had been captured or destroyed, and over 3,000 prisoners from a dozen species were free. But that wasn't the most important thing that happened. The most important thing was that those 3,000 beings went home to their worlds and told everyone what they had seen. They told them about humans who fought impossible battles and won. They told them about the human idea that freedom was worth any sacrifice. And they told them that the hegemony, for all its might, could be defeated. On Kythera, the mining supervisor Grolak called his workers together for their daily assignment briefing. Grolak was a member of the same species as the hegemony leadership, but he had worked on Kythera for 20 years. He had seen generations of miners break their backs digging rare minerals from the deep tunnels, while hegemony officials lived in luxury above ground. "I have received word from the hegemony high command," Grolak announced to the assembled workers. "They are increasing our quotas again. They want twice as much production, with no additional food or medical supplies." The workers looked at each other. Many of them were from species that had been conquered so long ago they barely remembered what independence meant. But they had all heard the stories about the humans and their impossible victories. One of the workers, an old Kitharan named Trix, stepped forward. "What if we refuse?" Grolak stared at him. In 20 years, no one had ever asked that question. "They will send troops to force compliance." "Then let them come," said Trix simply. "The humans showed us that the hegemony can be beaten. Maybe it's time we remembered how to fight." What followed was not a carefully planned rebellion. It was something more dangerous to the hegemony. It was a spontaneous uprising driven by hope. The miners didn't have weapons, but they had something more valuable. They had the knowledge of every tunnel, every weak point, every way in and out of their underground world. When the hegemony troops arrived, they found the mine entrances sealed and the workers vanished into the deep tunnels. The troops had the superior firepower, but the miners had home field advantage and the kind of desperate courage that comes from fighting for freedom after centuries of slavery. The siege of Kythera lasted 3 weeks. During that time, something amazing happened. A single human ship, the frigate Hope's Dawn, commanded by Captain Elena Vasquez, appeared in the Kythera system. Captain Vasquez looked at her tactical display and saw 12 hegemony warships surrounding the mining world. Her ship carried a crew of 45 and had weapons designed for fighting pirates. "Not engaging major fleet units, Captain," said her first officer, Commander Yang. "There's no way we can take on their entire fleet. We should call for reinforcements." Vasquez thought about the message they had received from the Kytheran miners. These people had risen up because they believed in the human example. They were fighting and dying because they had faith that someone would come to help them. "Negative, Commander. Those people down there are fighting for their freedom because they believe in us. I'm not going to let them down." What Captain Vasquez did next became one of the most famous battles in galactic history. Instead of attacking the hegemony fleet directly, she used her ship's fold space drive to appear right in the middle of their formation. While they were trying to target her fast-moving ship, she launched every shuttle and escape pod her ship carried. But these weren't just evacuation craft. Each one carried a squad of human marines and a cargo of weapons meant for the miners below. As the Hope's Dawn danced between the enemy ships drawing their fire, 45 different landing craft streaked down to the planet's surface. The battle for Kythera became a 3-way fight. The hegemony ground forces found themselves caught between the human marines above ground and the Kytheran miners below. The hegemony fleet couldn't use their heavy weapons without destroying the very facilities they were trying to protect, and Captain Vasquez kept her ship moving through their formation like a wasp in a garden, too small and fast to pin down but too dangerous to ignore. The turning point came when Sergeant Williams of the Human Marines managed to capture a hegemony communication post. Instead of using it to coordinate attacks, he used it to broadcast a message throughout the Kythera system. The message was simple. The hegemony forces were losing. That message was heard not just by the miners and marines but by hegemony soldiers who had been told their empire was invincible. For the first time, many of them began to doubt. Some even began to surrender rather than continue fighting a battle they no longer believed in. When the dust settled, Kythera was free. More importantly, word of the liberation spread to every world in the sector. Species that had been under hegemony rule for generations began to ask themselves a question they hadn't dared ask in centuries. What if we fought back? The hegemony high command called an emergency meeting. General Vox stood before the Strategic Planning Committee, looking at reports that made no sense according to everything they thought they knew about warfare. "The humans are not following any logical pattern," he reported. "They appear to be everywhere at once, but our intelligence suggests they have fewer than 100 ships total. They're inspiring uprisings on worlds they've never even visited. How is this possible?" The answer came from an unexpected source. A hegemony intelligence officer who had been studying human communications intercepts raised his hand. "Sir, I believe it's not about their technology or their numbers. It's about their message. They're not trying to conquer worlds, they're trying to liberate them. Every species they help sees them as allies, not new masters. They're turning our own subjects against us. General Vox stared at the young officer. You're saying they're winning by giving away their victories? In a way, yes, sir. They fight to free people, not to rule them. And free people fight harder than slaves. As General Vox contemplated this impossible situation, he had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Because at that very moment, Dr. Sarah Chen was putting the finishing touches on her newest invention, a communication system that could send messages instantly across the galaxy. Soon, every oppressed world would be able to coordinate with every other oppressed world. The galaxy was about to learn what Hapa Elder Keeper Vorthak sat in his private chamber aboard Nexus Prime, watching the galaxy burn. The ancient crystals that had preserved predecessor, knowledge for 50,000 years, now showed him something the long-dead civilization had never imagined. Their warning coming true faster than anyone thought possible. The tactical displays showed red dots spreading across the galaxy like infection markers. Each red dot represented a world in rebellion against the hegemony. What had started as isolated uprisings on mining worlds and colony planets had become something unprecedented, a galaxy-wide revolution. The humans have done in 2 years what we thought was impossible, Vorthak whispered to himself. They've given an entire galaxy the courage to dream of freedom. His meditation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Galactic Council. Admiral Krex appeared on the holographic display, but he looked nothing like the proud warrior who had dismissed human threats just 2 years earlier. His feathers were dull, his eyes were tired, and his voice carried a note of desperation. Elder Keeper, we need your help. The humans must be stopped. Stopped from doing what, Admiral? From liberating slaves? From giving hope to the hopeless? From destroying everything we've built? Krex's voice cracked with frustration. Look at what's happening. The hegemony is collapsing. Trade routes are cut. Entire sectors are in chaos. If this continues, our civilization will fall apart. Vorthak looked at the tactical display again. Perhaps, Admiral, it was already falling apart. Perhaps the humans have simply shown us what we refused to see. Far from Nexus Prime, the revolution was reaching a critical moment. The Nexus Cluster, a group of star systems that served as a major hegemony military base, had become the site of the largest space battle in galactic history. Admiral Sarah Chen, Dr. Chen's daughter who had risen through the ranks with incredible speed, commanded a fleet unlike anything ever seen before. Her ships came from dozens of different worlds and species. Kithran mining vessels equipped with human weapon systems, Altarian patrol boats with improved engines, even some former hegemony ships whose crews had switched sides. It wasn't the biggest fleet in the galaxy, but it was something new. A truly united force fighting for a common cause. Admiral Chen, reported Captain Torres from the bridge of his new ship. The heavy cruiser, Liberation. Enemy fleet is approaching on multiple vectors. Count shows 230 hegemony vessels. Sarah Chen looked at her own fleet count. 112 ships, most of them smaller than the enemy vessels. By traditional military thinking, this battle was already lost. But humans had never put much faith in traditional thinking. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Today we fight not just for victory, but for the future of the galaxy. Every species watching this battle needs to know that freedom can defeat tyranny, that courage can overcome fear, and that united we are stronger than any empire. She paused, looking out at the stars where so many different species had found the courage to stand up and fight. Remember what we're fighting for, not just our own freedom, but the freedom of every thinking being in the galaxy. All ships attack Pattern Omega. Show them what we've learned. The Battle of the Nexus Cluster lasted 18 hours and changed the nature of warfare forever. The humans had learned something important during their 2 years of fighting. Victory wasn't just about destroying your enemy. It was about convincing them to stop fighting. The battle began with traditional tactics. The hegemony fleet formed up in standard attack formations and advanced on the rebel fleet with overwhelming firepower. But Admiral Chen had studied every battle the humans had fought, and she had learned from each one. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, the rebel fleet scattered into small groups that used fold space jumps to appear behind enemy formations. While the hegemony ships were turning to engage these new threats, other rebel groups would jump in from different directions. But the real innovation came from Captain Martinez, commanding a group of former hegemony officers who had joined the rebellion. His ships didn't attack their former comrades, they talked to them. Attention hegemony vessels, this is Captain Martinez of the Free Fleet. 2 years ago, I was where you are now. I believed the hegemony brought order to the galaxy. I believed that conquest was better than chaos. His message was broadcast on all frequencies, reaching every ship in the enemy fleet. But I learned something from the humans. Order built on oppression isn't order, it's just organized cruelty. Real peace comes when people are free to choose their own path. Look around you. Look at this fleet. We have dozens of species fighting side by side, not because they were conquered, but because they chose to fight for something they believe in. The effect of Martinez's words was immediate and devastating to hegemony morale. For the first time, many hegemony crews realized they were fighting to preserve a system that oppressed everyone, including themselves. Ships began to surrender not because they were defeated in battle, but because their crews no longer believed in what they were fighting for. The turning point came when the hegemony flagship Eternal Dominion found itself surrounded by rebel ships. Admiral Vorthon, the hegemony fleet commander, prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender. But then something unprecedented happened. A single human shuttle approached his ship, broadcasting a request for permission to dock. Admiral Vorthon, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Free Fleet. I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing to listen. Against all protocol and tactical sense, Admiral Vorthon agreed to the meeting. 20 minutes later, he found himself face to face with a human female who looked barely old enough to command a single ship, much less an entire fleet. You're going to offer me terms of surrender, Vorthon said. No, replied Sarah Chen. I'm going to offer you something better. I'm going to offer you the chance to choose what happens next. She activated a portable holographic display showing the current state of the galaxy. Over half of all hegemony worlds were either in open rebellion or had declared independence. The remaining loyal worlds were cut off from each other by rebel-controlled space. Your empire is finished, Admiral, not because we destroyed it, but because people chose to leave it. You can keep fighting a war you can't win, or you can help us build something better. And what would that be? A galaxy where every species gets to decide its own fate, where trade is based on mutual benefit, not forced tribute, where conflicts are resolved through discussion, not conquest. Admiral Vorthon looked at the display for a long time. Finally, he asked the question that was troubling him most. Why should I trust you? If you win, won't you just become the new empire? Sarah Chen smiled, and in that smile, Vorthon saw something he had never expected to find in a military commander. Genuine kindness. Because that's not how humans work. We don't want to rule the galaxy, Admiral. We want to be free in it. And we've learned that we can't be truly free as long as others are enslaved. The surrender of the Eternal Dominion marked the effective end of hegemony naval power. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of something new. Admiral Vorthon and most of his officers joined the Free Fleet, not as prisoners or forced converts, but as allies who had chosen to fight for freedom rather than oppression. News of the Nexus Cluster victory spread throughout the galaxy with the speed that only hope can travel. On world after world, the final hegemony garrisons found themselves facing not just rebel armies, but their own former supporters who had lost faith in the system they once served. The Hegemony High Command met for the last time in their fortress capital on Hegemon Prime. General Vox looked around the table at the few remaining loyal commanders and saw defeat in every face. How did it happen so fast? Asked Admiral Rex. 2 years ago, we controlled 2/3 of the galaxy. Now we control less than 50 worlds. General Vox had been asking himself the same question. The answer, when it finally came to him, was both simple and terrifying. They weren't fighting us, he said slowly. They were fighting for something. And an army fighting for freedom will always defeat an army fighting for conquest. Because freedom gives people strength that conquest never can. He stood up and walked to the great window that looked out over the city that had been the center of galactic power for 3 centuries. Send a message to Admiral Chen. Tell her the hegemony formally surrenders. All remaining forces will stand down immediately. As the sun set on Hegemon Prime for the last time as the capital of an empire, General Vox reflected on the warning that Elder Keeper Vorthak had given 2 years earlier. The old keeper had been right about everything. The humans hadn't conquered the galaxy through superior firepower or advanced technology. They had liberated it through the simple, revolutionary idea that every thinking being deserved to be free. The galaxy would never be the same. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Nexus Cluster, and the galaxy was learning how to live without an empire. On the great space station that had once been called Nexus Prime but was now simply known as Unity Station, representatives from over 400 worlds gathered for the first Galactic Alliance assembly. The station itself had been transformed. Where once the corridors had echoed with the footsteps of officials from conquered worlds reporting to their masters, now they buzzed with the excited voices of free beings working together to solve common problems. The old imperial architecture remained, but it had been softened with gardens from 100 different worlds and artwork that celebrated diversity rather than domination. Elder Keeper Vorthak walked slowly through these changed corridors, his ancient frame supported by a mobility chair that had been designed by a cooperation between human engineers and Altarian artists. At over 3,000 years old, he was probably the only being in the galaxy who remembered what freedom had looked like before the rise of the hegemony. The main assembly hall was filled to capacity. Where one species had sat in assigned sections based on their rank in the imperial hierarchy, now they mixed freely. Humans sat next to former hegemony officers. Kitharan miners shared notes with Altarian diplomats. Even the massive Krogar, who had once been the hegemony's most feared enforcers, now served as peacekeepers for the Alliance. President Martinez of Earth stood at the central podium, but the title that mattered more to him was his role as the rotating chairman of the Alliance Council. The humans had insisted from the beginning that no single species should hold permanent leadership. Every world, regardless of size or power, had an equal voice in the Alliance. Friends and fellow beings, Martinez began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. 5 years ago, many of us were enemies. Today we gather as equals to face the challenges that come with freedom. He gestured to a holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy. Where the old maps had shown rigid imperial boundaries, now there were thousands of different colors representing independent worlds, voluntary associations, and mutual defense pacts. It hasn't been easy, Martinez continued. Freedom never is. When the hegemony fell, we inherited centuries of problems. Worlds that had been stripped of resources, populations that had forgotten how to govern themselves, economic systems built on forced labor and tribute. In the audience, Captain Torres listened with the attention of someone who had seen those problems firsthand. Now bearing the title of Galactic Mediator, he had spent the last 5 years traveling from world to world, helping former hegemony territories establish their own governments and resolve disputes with their neighbors. But we've also discovered something wonderful, Martinez said, his voice growing stronger. When people are free to choose their own path, they can accomplish miracles. The display changed to show images from across the galaxy. Kitharan mining operations that now used human fold space technology to reach previously inaccessible resources, sharing the wealth with every world in their sector. Altarian colonies that had become centers of learning, where beings from dozens of species came to study art, science, and philosophy. Former hegemony military bases that had been converted into research stations where scientists from every known civilization worked together to understand the mysteries of the universe. Admiral Sarah Chen, now serving as the Alliance's military coordinator, stood to address the assembly. Despite the peaceful transformation of the galaxy, there were still challenges that required careful attention. The old Imperial fleets have been disbanded, she reported. But we've learned that freedom requires protection. The Alliance Defense Force now operates under a simple principle. No world will stand alone against aggression, whether that aggression comes from outside our galaxy or from within it. She gestured to displays showing patrol routes that covered the entire galaxy. Unlike the old hegemony fleets that had been designed to control populations, the Alliance forces were small, mobile units designed to respond quickly to calls for help. Every ship in our fleet is crewed by volunteers from multiple species. Every mission is planned by councils that include representatives from the worlds being protected. We exist to serve, not to rule. The real test of the Alliance's principles came when former General Vox stood to address the assembly. Once the symbol of hegemony military power, he now served as the Alliance's Director of Reconstruction, helping former Imperial worlds transition to self-government. 5 years ago, I believed that order could only come through force, he said, his voice carrying a note of regret. I believed that freedom meant chaos, that choice meant conflict. I was wrong. He activated his own display showing statistics that would have amazed the old Galactic Council. Trade between worlds had increased by 400%. Scientific discoveries had accelerated beyond all previous records. Conflicts between species had decreased to their lowest levels in recorded history. Freedom doesn't create chaos, Vox continued. Freedom creates cooperation. When beings choose to work together instead of being forced to do so, they accomplish far more than any empire ever could. As the formal presentations continued, Elder Keeper Vorthak found his thoughts drifting back to the ancient warning that had started it all. The predecessors had been right about humanity's potential, but they had missed something important. The humans hadn't just changed the galaxy through their own actions. They had awakened something that had been sleeping in every species, the desire for freedom and the courage to fight for it. His meditation was interrupted by a gentle touch on his arm. He looked up to see Dr. Sarah Chen, now elderly herself but still carrying the spark of curiosity that had driven her to unlock fold space travel. "Elder Keeper," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what, honored doctor?" "For preserving the warning. For speaking the truth even when no one wanted to hear it. If you hadn't shared the predecessor records, we might never have known that someone had believed in us before we even believed in ourselves." Vorthak smiled, feeling something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Hope for the future. The predecessors saw your potential, but even they didn't see what you would become. You didn't just free the galaxy from the hegemony. You freed it from the idea that someone has to rule over everyone else. The assembly was drawing to a close with the traditional affirmation that ended every alliance gathering. Representatives from 400 worlds stood together and recited the simple oath that had replaced the old imperial pledges of loyalty. "We choose to be free. We choose to let others be free. We choose to work together by choice, not force. We choose to protect the right of every thinking being to determine their own fate." As the voices of hundreds of species filled the Great Hall, Captain Torres found himself thinking about the long journey that had brought them all to this moment. It had started with 3 human ships facing impossible odds near Mars. It had continued with miners on Kythera, who decided they would rather die free than live as slaves. It had grown into something that no military strategist or political philosopher had ever imagined, a galaxy-wide civilization based on voluntary cooperation rather than conquest. The formal assembly was over, but the real work was just beginning. In the smaller meeting rooms throughout Unity Station, beings from dozens of worlds were working on the practical problems that freedom brought. How to help worlds transition from imperial economies to free markets. How to preserve the knowledge and culture of species that had been suppressed for centuries. How to explore the vast regions of the galaxy that the hegemony had declared forbidden. But perhaps the most important work was being done in the station's schools and cultural centers, where young beings from every known species learned together. Here the children of former enemies played together, learned each other's languages, and grew up with the simple understanding that diversity was strength rather than weakness. A human child might work on a science project with a young Altarian, while a Kytheran student helped a former hegemony citizen's child with mathematics. They were growing up in a galaxy where their potential wasn't limited by their species or the world they came from, where they could choose their own dreams and work with anyone who shared those dreams. As Elder Keeper Vorthak made his way back to his chambers, he passed a group of these children working on a presentation about galactic history. One of them, a young human girl, looked up at him with bright, curious eyes. "Elder Keeper," she said, "our teacher told us you knew the predecessors' warning about humans. What do you think they would say if they could see the galaxy now?" Vorthak considered the question carefully. What would those long-vanished beings think of the galaxy their warning had helped to create? "I think," he said finally, "they would be amazed. They saw that humans could break the chains that bound the galaxy. But they never imagined that you would teach everyone else to break their own chains too." The girl smiled and returned to her work, part of a generation that would grow up taking freedom for granted, not because it was easy, but because so many beings had fought so hard to make it possible.